The evening started like any other Friday. My best friend Ronnie was over, hanging out as usual. We were lounging in the living room, chatting and joking, when my stepmom Natasha came down. At 63, Natasha had a commanding presence. Something about her made people take notice. I hadn't thought much of it before, but lately, something had changed. The way she dressed, the way she moved. It was clear she was aware of the attention she drew. I noticed Ronnie was aware too, his eyes following her every movement, though we never spoke about it. Natasha was dressed in a loosely tied silk robe, revealing just enough to make it hard to ignore. She entered the room with 2 glasses of wine, smiling in a way that made my heart race. "You boys look like you're having fun," she said, handing us the drinks. "Mind if I join?" I exchanged an uneasy glance with Ronnie, who looked just as uncomfortable, but neither of us declined. Natasha sat between us on the couch, crossing her legs, the robe's hem slipping up slightly. I tried to focus on the TV, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Ronnie was sneaking glances at her, and Natasha seemed to relish the attention. After a few moments of awkward silence, Natasha leaned in, her voice low. "I've noticed how you two look at me sometimes," she said, her gaze shifting between us. My heart skipped a beat, and Ronnie and I exchanged nervous glances, but we remained silent. Natasha smiled, her hand grazing my leg before moving to Ronnie's. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'm not offended. In fact, I've been thinking about it too." My mouth went dry, and I could see the mix of confusion and excitement in Ronnie's eyes. Natasha's hand lingered on Ronnie's thigh, her fingers drawing soft circles. She was testing boundaries, and it was working. "I know I'm older," she continued, her voice soft but inviting, "but that doesn't mean I don't have desires. And I've noticed you both have an interest." She smiled at Ronnie, then at me, her hand inching higher on Ronnie's leg. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. This was my stepmom, but the way she looked at us, the touch that sent shivers down my spine, made it impossible to resist. Ronnie shifted uncomfortably, but didn't move her hand away. Natasha's eyes glinted with satisfaction as she leaned closer, her breath warm on my ear. "I think it's time we stop pretending," she whispered. "I can feel the tension between us. Why don't we explore it?" I was stunned, unable to believe what I was hearing. My stepmom was suggesting something unthinkable, something I had never consciously imagined, though, admittedly, a part of me had. Her subtle touches, her smiles had been teasing us for weeks, and now everything was coming to a head. Before I could respond, Natasha turned to Ronnie, tracing her fingers up his arm. "What do you think, Ronnie?" she asked, her voice low and alluring. Ronnie's breath caught, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and desire. He looked to me, almost as if seeking permission, but I had no words. My heart was pounding, my mind screamed this was wrong, but my body was not listening. "I don't know," Ronnie stuttered, his voice shaky. Natasha smiled and leaned closer, her lips just inches from his ear. "Relax," she whispered, her hand sliding up his chest. "We're all adults here, let's just enjoy the moment." Ronnie swallowed, his gaze flicking between me and Natasha, torn but unable to resist. She leaned in and kissed his neck softly, and I could see his body responding to her touch. He wasn't going to stop this, and neither was I. Natasha pulled back, her eyes dark with desire as she turned to me. "What about you?" she asked, her hand now resting on my thigh. I couldn't answer immediately. My mind was a storm of conflicting feelings. Then Natasha leaned in, her lips brushing mine, soft and slow at first. When I didn't pull away, she deepened the kiss, her hand sliding further up my leg while the other moved back to Ronnie. I kissed her back, my heart racing and my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. The way she kissed made everything else disappear. Natasha pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting mine. "Good boy," she whispered before turning back to Ronnie. She kissed him more confidently this time, her hand exploring his chest. I watched, captivated, as she moved between us, her kisses growing deeper, her body pressing closer to his. The heat between us was intense, and Natasha was no longer holding back. Neither were we. She moved between us, her hands exploring our bodies, her lips shifting from Ronnie to me and back again. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and there was no going back. Natasha's hands roamed freely, touching my chest, Ronnie's back, pulling us closer into this strange, forbidden territory. Her touch was electrifying, sending waves of pleasure through me, and I could tell Ronnie felt the same. For what seemed like hours, we were caught in a whirlwind of kisses, touches, and soft gasps. Natasha was in control, leading us both with her hands and lips, igniting a fire I hadn't known was inside me. My stepmom, the woman I'd known for years, was now the center of my world, and I couldn't think of anything but her. At some point, Natasha's hand gently pushed me back onto the couch, and I lay there, breathless, as she climbed on top of me. Her robe had slipped open slightly, revealing more of her body, and the sight made my pulse quicken. Natasha leaned down, kissing me deeply as she pressed against me, her hands running up my arms. Ronnie was beside us, watching with eyes darkened by desire. Natasha reached out, pulling him closer, kissing him as her body stayed pressed against mine. We were lost in the moment, tangled together, our breaths mingling, our bodies moving in sync. Natasha's kisses became more urgent, her touch more insistent, and the passion between us built to a fever pitch. Ronnie was right there with us, his hands exploring her body, his lips grazing her neck and shoulders. Finally, Natasha pulled back, her breath coming in short gasps. She looked at us both, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "You boys did well," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I couldn't find the right words to say, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. I glanced at Ronnie, he looked just as bewildered as I felt. We had crossed a boundary that could never be undone, and there was no turning back. Natasha gave a knowing smile, then leaned in to kiss me one last time, soft and lingering. I think we all needed that, she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. She stood up, loosely tying her robe around her waist again, and walked out without another word. Ronnie and I sat in stunned silence, still processing everything. After a long pause, Ronnie finally broke the silence, his voice unsteady. "What just happened?" I shook my head, still in disbelief. "I don't know, man. I really don't know." We sat there a while longer, the weight of what had just transpired settling over us. We both knew Natasha was attractive, even captivating, but neither of us had expected things to escalate like they had tonight. Now that it was over, I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for all of us, for me, for Ronnie, and for Natasha. We had entered a space we could never return from, and I had no idea what the consequences would be. As Ronnie finally stood up to leave, he looked at me, his face a mix of confusion and excitement. "Do you think this will happen again?" he asked. I had no answer for him, so I just shrugged, my mind still foggy from the whirlwind of events. Ronnie lingered for a moment, waiting for me to say something, but I remained silent. Eventually he gave a half nod and headed for the door. As he opened it, he paused, glancing back. "Let me know if anything happens, all right?" I nodded, unsure what else to say. Yeah, sure. When the door closed behind him, I was left alone, the reality of everything that had happened sinking in. The house was quiet again, almost too quiet. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the lingering sensation of Natasha's touch, her lips, her warmth. It felt surreal, like I had just lived through a dream, but it was all too real. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty room, my thoughts spinning. What did this mean? How were we supposed to go back to normal? And the bigger question, did I even want to? The next morning I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my head swirling with thoughts of the night before. Natasha was still in the house, just upstairs, and I had no idea how to face her. My mind replayed the moments over and over, the kisses, the touches, the way her body felt against mine. It all seemed distant, yet it had just happened hours ago. I dragged myself out of bed, unsure of what to expect. As I went downstairs, the smell of coffee greeted me, and there was Natasha in the kitchen, dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, as if nothing had changed. She looked up and smiled softly. "Morning," she said casually, as if it were any other day. "Morning," I mumbled, unsure of how to act around her now. My mind flashed back to the previous night, but Natasha didn't seem the least bit fazed. She moved around the kitchen, making breakfast like everything was perfectly normal. I stood there awkwardly, watching her until I couldn't handle the tension any longer. "About last night," I started, but my voice faltered, unsure how to continue. Natasha turned and gave me a knowing look, her smile softening. "I figured you'd be thinking about that," she said, leaning against the counter. "You don't need to worry." "How can I not worry?" I blurted out. What happened was, It was Natasha raised her hand, stopping me mid-sentence. I know it was unexpected, but it doesn't have to be complicated. We're all adults, and we made a choice. We can leave it at that. Or... Her voice trailed off, and I noticed the way she tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking with mine. Or we can explore it a bit more. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected her to say that. Natasha wasn't treating this like a mistake or acting as if we had crossed an irreversible line. She was calm, composed, and she was giving me an option. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter now, uncertain of what I wanted her answer to be. Natasha stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. If you're interested, if Ronnie's interested, we don't have to stop here." Her hand gently touched my arm, the same warmth from last night flooding back. "There's no need to make this awkward unless you choose to." I swallowed hard, trying to process her words. Was this really an option? Could this continue? And if it did, what would that mean for all of us? Before I could respond, the sound of my phone buzzing broke the moment. I glanced down to see a text from Ronnie. "Hey man, what's going on?" Natasha saw the message too, and a small smile played at the corners of her lips. "Looks like Ronnie's curious," she said softly. "Maybe he's wondering if last night was a one-time thing." I stared at the text, my thoughts swirling. Part of me wanted to say it was over, that last night was a mistake, just too much wine and a lapse in judgment. But another part of me, the part that had been caught up in Natasha's touch, her kiss, the way she made me feel, wasn't so sure. Without really thinking, I typed a response to Ronnie's text. "You free later? We should talk." Ronnie came over that afternoon, and the moment he stepped inside, I could tell he was just as bewildered as I was. He avoided looking at me directly, his eyes darting around the house like he half expected Natasha to show up any second. "So what the hell happened last night?" he asked finally, his voice low and uncertain. I leaned back on the couch, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, man. It just happened." Ronnie sat down across from me, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, but that was your stepmom, and we were both involved." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly still trying to make sense of everything. "I don't know what to think of it." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Should I tell him about my earlier conversation with Natasha, where she hinted that last night didn't have to be the end? Before I could decide, Natasha walked into the room, instantly drawing our attention. She looked at Ronnie, then at me, smiling softly. "Hey, Ronnie," she greeted, her voice smooth and calm. I was hoping we could talk. Ronnie's eyes widened slightly, darting towards me, clearly unsure of what was coming next. Natasha sat down beside me, her hand briefly brushing against my knee before she turned her focus to Ronnie. "I know last night was unexpected," she began, her tone composed and steady, "but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I don't want this to be awkward between us. Last night doesn't have to be a one-time thing, but only if it's something you both want." Ronnie blinked, stunned by her directness. He looked at me, and I could see the confusion mixed with something else, a hint of curiosity, of desire, the same feelings I'd been struggling with all day. Natasha continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not asking for anything serious. This doesn't have to be complicated. I'm offering you both something different, something exciting, but only if you're comfortable with it." A long pause followed as Ronnie and I exchanged glances, trying to process what Natasha was suggesting. The room was thick with tension, the kind that made my heart race and my thoughts spin. Finally, Ronnie spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And if we say yes, what happens then?" Natasha's smile widened slightly. "Then we see where it goes," she said simply. "No pressure, no strings, just us." The air around us buzzed with anticipation as we sat there, absorbing her words. This was real. Natasha was serious, and now it was up to us to decide. Ronnie glanced at me again, searching for some sign of what I was thinking. At that moment I realized I didn't want to say no. The part of me that had been resisting, the part that was afraid of what this all meant, was losing to the part of me that craved more. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding. "I'm in," I said quietly, my voice steady, even as adrenaline rushed through me. Ronnie hesitated for just a moment longer before nodding too. "Yeah," he said, his voice resolute. "I'm in." Natasha's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she stood up and stepped toward Ronnie, her hand gently touching his arm. "Good," she whispered. "Let's not waste any more time." She leaned in and kissed him softly, her lips lingering on his briefly before she pulled away. Then she turned to me, her eyes filled with promise, as she leaned down and kissed me too. The same soft, lingering kiss sent a shiver through me. When Natasha pulled back, she smiled at both of us, her gaze holding the same intensity as the night before. "Now," she said softly, "let's continue what we started." The rest of the afternoon blurred together, a rush of sensations, kisses, touches, and the heat of our bodies intertwined as we explored this new, forbidden territory. Natasha took the lead, guiding us both. Her touch igniting a fire in me that I hadn't realized was there. Each time it felt like we were crossing a line, she would pull us back in with a kiss, a whisper, or a reassuring touch. Ronnie and I were caught in the same current, our movements synchronized with Natasha's, the tension between us building and building, until it finally erupted in a moment of pure, undeniable passion. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just the three of us lost in the moment, completely immersed in each other.